what we have is kind of a deep dive into a very vast spectrum, which is the spectrum of comms. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but when you're at a little startup, comms and marketing tend to be lumped together. And the bigger you grow, the more you realize, actually, comms is like a very special animal. And it's very much a specialty. People are trained in it. And they know what to do when there's a crisis. And they know how to act when someone decides to light up Twitter and it's your founder and you have to answer for them. And they know what to do when there's a phone call that comes in from an expert group class action lawyer for data privacy, which is a situation I found myself in the earlier days of Segment when we made the news for nothing. It's because people didn't understand our product and lumped us in with some shady practices that we had literally nothing to do with. And we spent the entire day trying to tell people in the company, do not pick up the phone. These people are calling us all day. They're trying to reach our employees. They're trying to reach our people. And full-blown crisis mode, you call in the real professionals. So I'm very pleased to bring up Caitlin Epstein and Ulysses King, who are the real pros. And we're going to talk about the full comms org over, I don't know, a mixed 30 years of experience collectively. Okay, so I would love for you guys to introduce yourselves. And the way that you should do it is talk about where you've spent your career, and especially make it clear where you were in-house, where you were out-of-house in an agency, and maybe if you specialized in a certain type of client, so that we have a pretty good idea of what the spectrum looks like. Maybe we start with Ulysses.
Okay. All right, well, I'm Ulysses King. I have worked in high-tech comms for 24 years, both in-house and agency side. On the agency side, I've worked at Outcast and my most recent employer, Archetype. Currently launched a division at Archetype called Archetype Ascend, which is all about providing strategic comms and support for Black and brown founders, executives, and VCs. And so launched that last year and have had the pleasure to work with some amazing brands on that work. But prior to that, I worked in-house at Humane for nearly 3 years when the company was primarily in stealth, so we can get into some of that. And also worked at a startup called Kite, which was in the early stages of live streaming. So this was on the N97 platform before Facebook, Twitter, any other company had live streaming. Kite was the company that kind of introduced that. And so, yeah, we can talk a lot about all those different things, but it's been quite a ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm Caitlin Epstein. We were just talking before we got on here, since we're comms people, people are always like, you must love talking in front of people. And we're like, we never talk in front of people. We're always behind the scenes. So that's the joke for PR people. I started an agency. It was called Eastwick. It's now called Hotwire. I spent my beginning of my career there, which I think is a very common path for in-house comms people. I went to a startup after that and then ended up at Twilio, where I've been for the last 9 years. I think I've gotten the full spectrum of PR there, from when we were relatively unknown and our CEO was like always telling me no one cares about us. And then we sort of opened the tech IPO market in 2016, which put us on the map. And then all of a sudden we were more of a darling for a while, and then have had harder times as well. So I've been through all the phases at Twilio, and I really value my agency start and think that's a really important part of being a comms person. But now I'm on the in-house side.
Mm-hmm. House side, okay. So one thing that came up for me when I was recruiting experts to come join us is you guys tend to have, or the good ones, let's put it this way, the good PR leaders who are executive level, like world class, they have incredible endurance and staying power. Are you guys familiar with the stats for CMOs? 18-month tenure and only getting worse. It's very sad. It makes me sad. But these guys, Ulysses spent 10 years at Outcast. Caitlin has spent nearly 9 years at Twilio. And some of the other comms execs that I've worked with in the past, the VP of comms at Cloudflare has been there for 10 years. The VP of comms at Wealthfront has been there for 10 years. What is it about comms that enables that level of endurance? Is a career.
It's interesting. I never thought about it that way until you brought it up. But I think the best comms is often about the people and putting a face to the technology, especially if you have a founder CEO that's like very helpful. So for me, at least, I'll speak for myself and what I've seen with a lot of people that work with founder CEOs, it takes a long time to get the story out. Like I think, and you learn this human that's running this company over time and the people that they've hired to support them. And you're sort of telling a story over time. It's not something you can execute in a quarter or even a year. I think one of my earliest bosses told me, like, whatever your message is, you need to say the same exact thing for 18 months before anyone will hear it. And so I think for PR, that's been my path. Like I always just felt there was more to do and more of the story to tell for this particular founder that I worked with. So I think that's part of it. If you work with a founder CEO, you want to round out the story and tell the whole growth path, and you can't do that in short form.
Totally, absolutely.
You know, so Outcast, I was actually there for about 14 years, and I was what we called a boomerang, where I left once to go to a startup, and then I came back with Kite. And so, you know, it's really about the dynamic nature of an agency. You have so many different clients. So, you know, working with brands like Nike and Amazon, the NFL, you know, that experience, you know, bleeds into other opportunities. And, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, magnetic brands at Archetype. I think companies want to be in good company with other brands. And so when you're at an agency, it's really easy to, if it's a good agency and you enjoy the people you work with, it's really easy to stay there for a long time, as you know, new opportunities are constantly coming in. If you're lucky enough to work with a VC firm, as we were at Outcast, there's also this incredible, you know, channel funnel of early stage companies that are constantly coming through the doors. And so, you know, I realized in my second in-house experience that I really am probably more of an agency person, because I love that diversity of work. You know, you can be working on, you know, quantum computing one moment and, you know, consumer tech the next moment. So I enjoy that diversity of work.
That is the most like impressive thing about agency people, that they can just go from all these different companies and tell this story. It's amazing.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, so I have a question for you from the perspective of being at an agency like Outcast, because I don't know if you guys share this perception, but over the past 15 years, it's been my observation that there's a handful of tier one PR agencies, especially in tech. But of that handful of tier one agencies, it's been my perception, and we can argue about this, that the number one has been Outcast. And so when a company gets to work with Outcast and it's a startup, the rest of us were like, ooh, they got Outcast. Like, they got Outcast on it. So I would imagine if the doors, more or less, there's always a line, people want to be working with Outcast. How do you choose a client then?
Yeah, so, you know, our filter at Outcast was leaders and disruptors, right? So is this company going to change the game in some sort of way? Are the founders with this company, is this person, you know, a dynamic, you know, person? And so, you know, working with folks like Diane Green, Mark Benioff, Aaron Levy, it just gave you incredible experience and access to amazing people. And what I appreciated about the Outcast network is it's quite strong. So, you know, all of my colleagues, you know, who I came up with are in different places right now. And that network has been incredible. I mean, in Archetype, where I am now, we're actually a sister agency of Outcast. So we're both owned by a British holding company called Next 15. So we still do a lot of work together. But it's great. You know, we were fortunate enough to come up in a time where, you know, the mobile revolution was happening, you know, virtualization computing was happening for the first time. You know, what was called on-demand computing became cloud computing. So it was just the right time for Outcast, and you know, learned at the feet of Margit Venmakers and Karen Maroney, two incredible, incredible women. So just great timing, I think is
Timing,
the short of it
gotcha.
all, yeah.
Caitlin, we talked a little bit about Twilio before in the context of Ask Your Developer.
Yeah.
And Twilio really being at the vanguard of like the developer is queen, or developer is like the tip of the pyramid movement, I feel like, in Silicon Valley. And in the earliest days, there was maybe some difficulty because it's very like outsider-ish. If you're not a developer, right, like then are you even a person? Like, am I even qualified to speak with you?
Yeah.
And I feel that we have really crested that peak like years ago. But in the very beginning days, you had a billboard up that said, Ask Your Developer. And then Jeff Lawson, the CEO founder, wrote a book called Ask Your Developer.
Yes.
And
one
I would love to
book
hear.
I've ever completed.
Oh, love it. Yes.
Yeah.
So talk about the book and the movement and like what it was like at the time to be at that vanguard.
I think what I learned from that, and this is like always my advice to people trying to do early stage PR, is like figure out what your message is. It doesn't need to, you don't have to have articulated your 10-year vision, but you need something that your brand's going to be associated with. And Jeff was really smart in the early days that was developer. And every single piece of content that we put out had developer. If we put a press release to him, even later in our journey where we were selling to a broader range of buyers, he'd say, I don't see a developer in this press release. Like, it was the consistency of that made us really synonymous with like the developer and the builders. And I think that's almost the most important thing in the early, especially early. I mean, you have to just be disciplined in comms. I think that's the hardest thing when you're just like, I'll take any press I can get, and you just want to talk on any topic. But like the reality is, it works best if you say the same thing over and over and over again. And for Twilio, that was developer. So I credit him for that completely. You know, he was getting shut down from every VC in Silicon Valley in the early days because he thought developers were buyers, and he was told they were not. And obviously, it worked out for him. But that was something that was just very consistent and very clear guidance we got as the marketing team at Twilio. Like, developers were built by developers for developers, and even when we moved up the stack and who our buyer was, we had to be consistent in making sure that they were always the hero of the story. So even if we did like a customer case study later on some big company, we always tried to spotlight which developer actually built the integration of Twilio into the product. So yes, that was the billboard that lasted for a long time. We get a lot of credit for that. There's also a lot of debate internally on whose idea it was. No one will take credit for it, which I think is hilarious. Like, both everyone and no one takes credit for it. And then, yes, Jeff wrote his book, which was a whole different journey. If anyone ever wants advice on how to promote a book, we were like blind leading the blind. And we did it. So I do have a lot of tips on that. It's very different than traditional PR.
I bet.
And it was great. Honestly, what we use that more than anything for is like a sales enablement tool.
Sure.
That's what it's more than anything. Our sales team brings that book. They highlight chapters. They say, this reminds me of your problem you're facing. And that's what we use. We use that probably more than anything.
That's amazing to highlight the book, to highlight pieces of the book for people.
Yeah.
Well, speaking about slightly non-traditional PR tactics and methods, one of your breaks from agency life, you joined a company called Humane, and you were there for 2 years. People in the audience might know Humane now because it's the AI pin, and it was probably the original AI pin where people are like, this is an AI pin, and you know, it's like a big deal. But Ulysses joined when it was in stealth, and I think when you joined, it didn't even have a name. So tell me about doing PR when a company is in stealth.
Yeah, so was it with Humane for almost 3 years. They actually knew what their name was when we first met. When I was at Outcast, they had just left Apple and were thinking about a few different things, and they had a few different product ideas. And so we did a messaging and positioning exercise because they really didn't know how to talk about themselves. And so once that work wrapped, we stayed in touch. You know, anyone who's worked with Apple before, they don't really let the rank and file, you know, talk to the media very much. And so Imran and Bethany really didn't have much of a profile in the industry despite working on groundbreaking products. And so I started to introduce Imran to different friendlies in the industry, everyone from an Ian Spalter, who was head of design at Instagram, who was my client at the time, to Stephanie Mehta, who was, editor-in-chief of Fast Company at the time. And, just to get his name out there. And so after about a year and a half of that, walk-in talks with Imran and things like that, they asked me to join the company. And I felt it was a little too early, but I also had the pleasure of knowing what they were building. So everyone who joined Humane, and I joined in November of 2019, I was employee number 8. Everyone who joined did not know what they were building, or they had no idea what they were going to be working on until they actually joined the company.
Wow.
So I was in a privileged position in that I knew what we were building. Because when I met them, they had a few different ideas that they were considering, and it actually was Mark Benioff who told them, no, you need to do this one over here. Mark was an early advisor of Humane and very, very helpful to us in early days. So anyway, it was challenging to do that. There's a lot of things you can do when you're in that phase, especially as you're trying to build a team, right? So it's a lot of employer brand communications. We're trying to attract the top, developers and engineers in the world. Imran coming from Apple and having something like 400 patents under his name for his work on the iPad, watch, computer, all the things, had a very high bar. And so was a little bit unsure whether there was the right talent out there to do what they were trying to do. So it was very much about building up their pedigree, explaining the role that they played in introducing these products, and starting to, I hate the word, become thought leaders. And so that work, definitely carried us through for some time. We would celebrate, whenever it was like the iPad's 5-year anniversary or the Apple Watch's, anniversary, we would make it clear, the role that Imran and Bethany played in the introduction of that. And that was very helpful in getting people to pay attention to what we were doing and come in and interview, right? And so, we did some other things down the line that I'm sure people have opinions on, but there were ways to be creative and focus on the people in that time. So
Fantastic. I have a question about in-house and out-of-house agency life. So at every startup that you go to work at, or honestly, if you go to work at any company that is like pre-PR agency or pre-comms team, there comes a moment where there's just a marketer or a group of marketers, and the leadership is like, should we get a PR agency? Yeah. And I think that there are a number of constraints that you should be aware of before you're equipped to answer that question. Should we get a PR agency? Do you have the right people on staff? Who are those people? Who must you have in place before you get an agency? And then when it's time to get an agency, how do you actually work with them to make that expenditure worthwhile? I'll let you guys take it from here.
I think the first question you have to ask is why they think they need it. Like, you very frequently hear that, like, we need to PR this. And it's like, but what are we trying to achieve? And that's probably the first question. I think a lot of startups have they know that they need to get their story out there, but they don't really know why. They just feel like it's something they have to do. So I think first is getting to find out if you're ready, is understanding, like, if you know your story, because maybe what you really need is someone to help you come and articulate your story. And if you really are going to have, if you're at the maturity where you're going to have enough news coming out, and of course you make news, that's like our job, but if your company's moving at a pace of growth and velocity, that there's going to be enough coming out from the company to warrant an ongoing program. So like frequently the first time a startup does PR is around raising money, and that's always a good thing. But sometimes it's like you might have raised money, but you're not going to have a product launch. You don't have executives that are ready to speak, And then what's inevitably gonna happen is you're gonna think your agency sucks. And that is like, agencies always get the blame, and it's very rarely their fault. Like, you really have to make sure the person in-house has to be really articulating, what they're trying to achieve, what the business goals are, and arming the agency with the people and the news to be able to actually tell that story. So I think a long-winded way of saying, you probably need to get to the crux of why you think you need PR.
Yep.
And then before you decide to go to an agency. And there are other routes, like you can bring someone on as a project or bring someone on as a consultant, or honestly, founders can just go out and start talking to reporters, just totally relationship building without the expectation of press, a press result, to sort of figure out what they're interested in and get a better feel for it before you go straight to agency. And then when you are ready for an agency, it's like an amazing asset to have. I value our agency partners very deeply, but I think when I hear someone ask me like, oh, we had this agency, but they didn't really get us anything or whatever, I'm like, there's probably more to that story.
Absolutely.
There's always more to the story, for sure. The value of an agency really is perspective and scale or speed, for those of us who've worked in-house before, it's very easy to lose perspective. You're working on this one thing and your founders and your team feel like it's the most important thing ever. That's why you're there. Yeah. And you're in a lot of meetings, And, once you're done with all of that, you're like, as a comms person, okay, so how do I even make time to develop a narrative or, grab coffee with a reporter, right? And so your agency team really can provide that, value while you're caught up in meetings and while you're really, stressing over this one document or deck that needs to get done for the executive leadership team. Your agency should be out there keeping their pulse on what's happening, what are the discussions happening, who are the reporters that they need to really get to know and influence, the trends and things like that. And then obviously you have a team, so there are more people who can be doing that work and helps you accelerate your business, right? When you're in-house, the value on that side, and Imran very much felt this early on, why he wanted me to come in-house so early was just like, we need to figure this stuff out from day one. We don't want to just build and then figure out, okay, so how are we going to talk about this, right? Like, we have blind spots. You have perspective. How do we start to talk about these things, right? And so that's very much the value. But if you're not ready to, turn on the faucet and really go, perhaps it's better to have, a consultant, because there was a lot of things that I wanted to do when I was in-house that they just weren't ready and comfortable with. As a designer, as a team of founders that came from Apple that doesn't talk about anything until launch day. There were a lot of things that, I knew were tried and true strategies and tactics from working with a whole host of brands, B2B or consumer, that were effective, that were just really, really uncomfortable for them. And so, to Caitlin's point, you have to ask yourself, why do you feel like you're ready for an agency now? Are you really ready to go? Because if you're not, like maybe a freelancer consultant would be better than even hiring an in-house person. So yeah.
There's a lot more questions that I want to ask you, but we have time for one, and I think I'll make it tactical. My tactical question is, you mentioned pinging reporters and being like, you want to get a coffee sometime?
Yeah.
How do we do this? And when do you make your move? Like, how do you think about that tactically for those of us who don't have our PR agencies in place yet and want to do something to build relationships?
Yeah. I would say it's kind of like dating, but it's been so long since I've dated, and I was fortunate enough to not date in the online apps world. But, the first thing you have to do is know who you're talking to. So take the time to read their stories, understand who they are, what they're writing about, understanding the outlet, the focus of the outlet. And then, we all love flattery, right? We all have egos. And so, one of the best things that you can say to reporters is, I read that story that you wrote the other day and fill in the blank, right? I I disagreed with that, or it really resonated with me, right? And just be authentic, right? Because obviously media have a lot of people like myself hitting them up trying to get their attention. So I think we all can smell inauthentic people, right? And so be genuine in your approach and just reach out, you know. Chances are, you know, you're a company that is someone that they want to know more about, or you're in a space that is interesting and newsworthy. And so just take the time, though, before you hit send to know who's on the other end and what they've been writing about, and understand that their job is not to write a commercial for you. I think a lot of early stage founders and even some late stage founders make that mistake, thinking that it's their job to make you look good. It's not. You know, they are the fourth estate. Their job is actually to inform us as, you know, consumers about what's going on within the four walls of these companies and why you should pay attention to this space, right? And that may not always be super favorable for you. And you need to be okay with that because your approach is everything. So, you know, try not to make it so transactional and like you want something out of it, out of them. Be a resource to these journalists. You have something to offer. You have perspective. You have a lot of information that they don't know about. So those are some of the ways in which you can, you know, not bother reporters and reach out to them. And yeah, you just email them. You know, I read your story. Sometimes it's great to put regarding and putting a headline of the story that most spoke to you, because they'll get that attention right away. So some things that have worked over the years.
I totally agree with that advice. My one thing I would say is, like, don't get discouraged. I had my CEO reach out to How I Built This once because they were ignoring me. And I was like, maybe it'll work, just try it. And then he was like, they ignored me. And I'm like, yeah, that's how happens to me every day of my job. So reporters are not going to respond to everyone. I think the hit rate's usually like 10% of pitches get responses or something like that. So keep trying, keep following the reporters, figure out where you can add some value or be a resource to them, just like Ulysses said, and yeah, don't get discouraged.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. I think we have a much greater understanding of comms than when we started. I think, right?
Thank you.
Sure.